Around 5 years ago, I made a video titled Infinite Scalers and how it was a potentially useless mechanic despite seemingly appearing to be overpowered on paper. The idea that a champion's power level could rise indefinitely throughout the course of a match, especially when every other champion in the game had a ceiling on how strong they could get, would lead you to believe they're supposed to be superior, right? Of course, everything is contextual, and in that video I went over how for most of the infinite scalers of old, pragmatically it doesn't matter how much power you accumulate over time, rather how you're able to exercise that power, which in their case resulted in a more deflated experience than what people might have initially anticipated. Yet so, Riot has been increasingly pushing out more and more infinitely scaling or infinitely stacking champions. Not only has the frequency of new stackers been fairly high, but the extent of their ability to exercise their growing power has also improved a lot. For a while, I was under the impression that infinite scaling was a relic of the past, a gimmicky and flawed mechanic that created more trouble than benefit for the player. But after seeing the new Fiamani rework, I took a look back and noticed that infinite scaling is still being implemented quite often. So for today, we're going to be revisiting the topic and seeing what has changed about infinite scaling. Has it been made more practical, and if so, what are the pros and cons of this new infinite stacking epidemic? Having just been under half a decade since the original episode, my god, I'm getting old. For those who haven't seen that video, let's do a quick recap on the situation with infinite scaling for many of the older champions. By and large, much of the old guard were victims of infinite scaling rather than beneficiaries. Because of their capacity to grow in power endlessly, Riot made sure to limit what they could do so as not to result in an overpowered champion. For example, looking at Nasus. In concept, his Q being able to gain power infinitely sounds appealing in that you can go full tank and still do hella damage. In practice, his complete lack of mobility and primarily single target kit makes it rather easy for him to get kited in teamfights or blocked by a frontline who can take multiple Qs to break down, at which point even with tank items, the enemy team would break Nasus apart with a modicum of coordination. In concept, Veigar is able to accumulate incredible sums of ability power to increase the strength of his damaging abilities, eventually arriving at a point where any one of his Q, W, or ultimate can easily do 4 figures in damage. In practice, Veigar's comparatively short threat radius and lack of mobility will never allow him to comfortably exert pressure against enemies, and even if he has over 1000 AP, he could still struggle with breaking through enemy frontline. The fundamental flaw of infinite scaling, which also doubles as a form of keeping it in check, is that in the vast majority of scenarios, the game will end before the actual threat of infinite scaling begins to take shape. Sure, if Nasus had 3000 stacks or Veigar had 3000 AP, then no team composition will be able to stand against them because at that point, they'll have ascended past the stat boundaries of a normal champion. The reality, however, is they'll never get there. 99 times out of 100, Nasus, Veigar, Thresh, what have you will respectively have Q stacks, ability power, and armor within bounds of a normal champion because their power budgets are contingent on building up those stacks. That rule applies to most of League's infinite scalers. The only thing that grows in strength is a singular metric that rarely bleeds into other aspects of their kit. Sion and Cho'Gath, for instance, can amass a staggering amount of health, which may or may not lead to them dealing more damage in the long term. That being said, their clunky abilities and telegraph playstyle make it so they'll never reach a point where the enemy team, provided they have at least one tank buster, can stop them. It's also why Heartsteel is not as dangerous of an item as it may initially appear. That, and such as the power of % health damage, it scales in proportion to the target, no matter how much HP they have. I mean, obviously if your team has no tank buster, then yeah, Cho'Gath and Sion become damn near invincible, but the champions themselves have a limited capacity in pressure. However, 3 notable things have been taking place throughout the past, I would say, 5 years that has led to infinite scaling not only becoming more prevalent, but more viable and effective as well. First and foremost, the types of champions getting them. Prior, infinite scaling was reserved only for a certain type of champion, typically melees like Nasus, Shyvana, Cho'Gath, and Sion. The only proper ranged DPS champion that got infinite scaling was the Burst Mage and Veigar, and even then, Veigar's a lot weaker of a champion if we measure purely by capability. There's a reason for that. Universal factors are in place to temper a champion's carry potential. For example, melees, they have to constantly deal with the ever-present disadvantage they have against ranged opponents. All the power in the world means absolutely nothing if you can't actually get close to your target to hit them, right? Well, if you take a look at some of the more recent infinite scalers, you'll find the classes they represent to be far more capable of carrying games. One of the more early releases being Kindred. Kindred is a marksman, a rather mobile marksman at that. They can reposition during a fight rather frequently by way of a 2-second cooldown on their Q while W is active, and being a ranged auto-attacker, they can easily take whatever their infinite scaling parameters are and exert them on the enemy team, making their power increase more threatening. Another one would be bel'veth. Bel'veth's a skirmisher. Skirmishers have among the highest carry potential out of any melee class, next to their sister class, the assassin. Being highly mobile and possessing DPS on par with the marksman, despite her melee status, bel'veth can and often does effortlessly blast her way through enemy teams. Infinite scaling was once kept only for tanks, bruisers, supports, and a singular mage. Now the range of classes to whom it's given has extended beyond that, and said classes are better at capitalizing on the inherent benefits of growing stronger indefinitely. The second factor, what form the infinite scaling comes in. Again, ordinarily in the past, infinite scaling came in just one singular stat. For Sion it was HP, for Nasus it was Q damage, for Veigar it was ability power. Thresh technically had two stats in armor and ability power, but being a support, you're never at all concerned about him suddenly one-shotting you and being too tanky. This allowed for champions to become stronger over time while maintaining their vulnerabilities. Reiterating once more, Nasus can have 1000 stacks and still struggle to pressure opponents in a teamfight on account of being tied to single target and being an immobile melee champion. But when you take a look at new infinite scalers, it tends to be less about stats and more about properties, or a mixture of both. By collecting marks, Kindred gains bonus attack speed on their Q, bonus current health damage on most attacks in W, and bonus missing health damage on their E, resulting in higher attack frequency and better sustained DPS against tanky enemies. They also gain bonus attack range, but technically there's a cap to it, although I suppose we can include that as well. More attack range is always helpful as it widens your threat radius, making it easier for you to attack opponents without them being able to attack you. And in the case of Kindred, once they reach around 10 to 13 marks, their attack range begins to contest Caitlyn and Jinx's. Another example would be Aurelion Sol. Stardust accumulated by a Sol results in a multitude of new properties added to his repertoire. First, Breath of Light deals bonus max health damage. Percent health damage on the likes of Kindred and Asol is significantly more consequential than flat damage on Veigar and Nasus, as against the latter two, they can have a hard time bursting through a tank to get to the targets they actually want to kill, whereas Kindred and Asol not only have an easier time nuking the squishy backline, but also shredding the enemy frontline, meaning no one is safe from their pressure. Additionally, Asol gains bonus range on his W Flight, his singularity grows in size, potentially reaching a point where it can expand to the width of the entire dragon or Baron pit and then some, and most critically, the execution threshold at the center grows in power too. Typically in the mid to late game, Asol's singularity execution happens around 10% or higher, making his E a mini Elder Dragon buff essentially. Finally, of course, Falling Star grows in size, and then gains the added property of the semi-global shockwave to go along with it. Altogether, Asol gains more DPS, more range, and more area coverage. Case in point, infinite scaling is affecting more than just damage or defense. Now it's affecting range, uptime, coverage, etc. Building off that, we have the third factor, the extent to which infinite scaling affects the champion overall. The keystone facet of infinite scaling for older champions was that it never expanded on the champion's ability. Swain did become tankier with every soul fragment he extracted, but his Q, W, E, and ultimate kept their finite properties. Cho'Gath would gain bonus health and damage on his E and ultimate, making him more durable and more damaging, but the range of applications of his toolkit, save for the area coverage of orbital spikes, were exactly the same. If hypothetically Cho'Gath's stacks were to mimic the effects of Asol or Smolder's stacks, his Q would grow in size, his W would perhaps increase in silence duration or AoE, and his E would maybe gain additional hits beyond the 3. If Veigar were to scale as such, his Q would be able to strike more than 2 targets, his W would grow in radii, and his E would gain the ability to pull enemies towards the edges of his cage. You can imagine how terrifying that would be, right? Yet it's happening for those champions. Senna, for instance, has one of the most overpowered passive abilities in the game. For every stack of mist acquired, she gains bonus attack damage, and every 20 stacks or so, she gets bonus range and crit chance, with any excess crit chance converting into lifesteal. Bonus damage, bonus range, bonus crit chance for even more damage, and then bonus healing by lifestealing off that damage. Furthermore, Piercing Darkness grows in range accordingly to Senna's own attack range, and the slow and healing scales based on her AD. Plus, with her Q refunding 1 second cooldown per auto attack, bonus attack range affords her more consistent cooldown refund without having to put herself in danger. In other words, Senna becomes more consistent. Lastly, Dawning Shadow's shield strength also scales off her stacks, so in total, Senna deals more damage, gains more range to apply that damage more often while diminishing the risk of counterattack, her Q slows more heavily, can reach further, and she can spam it more often as a result of that bonus attack range, which leads to more healing for her team and more shielding on her ultimate. Anyone who's had to deal with the late game Senna can attest to her likely being a higher priority target to shut down than the actual ADC. Even champions who infinitely scale to a lesser extent still acquire considerably increased aptitude with their scaling. Take bel'veth, the only thing she gets is bonus attack speed. However, when evaluating her passive in context with the rest of her kit, the benefit she gains from it far exceeds the respective stats of older infinite scalers. Bonus attack speed means faster on-hit rate, making items like Terminus, Kraken Slayer, and Blade of the Ruined King proc faster and more frequently in a shorter time. Attack speed is effectively cooldown reduction for auto attacks, so it's like Veigar's W cooldown decreasing proportionally to his stacks. Actually, in bel'veth's case, attack speed quite literally is cooldown reduction. The cooldown of her W directly decreases based on her attack speed, giving her faster tempo. bel'veth also gets more attacks on her Royal Maelstrom based on her bonus attack speed, which also gives her bonus healing by way of the extra lifesteal she gets during that channel, and of course more on-it effects. Finally, bel'veth's infinitely scaling true damage on her ultimate ramps up even faster with more attacks. There's a reason she turns into an absolute demon in the mid to late game. Her base skin already affords a massive threat radius by virtue of her mobility, making the bonus attack speed extremely efficient in getting her damage out faster. As you can see, despite only getting attack speed and nothing else, her kit's designed to exponentiate the value of that attack speed beyond the intrinsic benefits provided. Now, I would go over Smolder, who is arguably the most prominent example of how overloaded infinite scaling is gotten, but I think you get the point by now. If anything, Smolder is the end product of power creep in infinite scaling. People are terrified of the 225 stack breakpoint because Smolder goes from a competent marksman to basically an infinitely better Ezreal, and then as time goes on, he gets more splash damage, more burn damage, more regular damage, hybrid damage, making it harder to itemize against him, etc. The infinite scaling archetype has practically polymerized with the evolution archetype to create the best of both worlds. They basically combined the permanent stacking of Nasus, Cho'Gath, Veigar, Sion, and Thresh with the ability upgrading property of Victor, Kai'Sa, and Kayle if you think about it, and I for one am beginning to feel a bit concerned by it. It could just be unpopular opinion, but the idea of a game being put on a time limit purely because the enemy team has a champion that can grow in power and ability over time by basically existing can run the risk of a self-fulfilling prophecy, where you feel a sense of urgency in trying to close out the game before Smolder, Aesol, or Senna become too strong, which in turn causes you to go for risky plays that can accidentally backfire, and if they do, you end up getting outscaled anyway. There's nothing inherently wrong with infinite scaling, mind you. There is a place for it in League, but I feel like Riot has become too lax with the mechanics constraints, primarily in the sense that they made it increasingly more difficult to stop infinite scalers from stacking up. For Nasus, not only was his infinite scaling not really much of a threat, but you could also prevent him from stacking by bullying him early game and zoning him away from the wave. In contrast, it's a more arduous task to zone away an Aesol or Smolder because they're ranged and have AoE, and they can also stack up by attacking you directly. They don't have to explicitly stack on just minions. While we're on the subject of ease of stacking, I actually like how they design Kindred's marks. Good teams can cooperate to prevent them from stacking, and the Kindred player has to be very aware of which targets they can realistically kill. If hypothetically they gained a mark just by killing any target, not the one they specifically chose, it would make their passive a lot more impressive. But for Smolder, Aesol, Senna, bel'veth, Shyvana to a degree, who can gradually but inevitably reach their 1v9 state by doing nothing but farming and playing the game the way every other champion does, I don't particularly agree with how liberal Riot's been in making champions go stronger without taking proper risks, especially with how massive the payoff is. Granted, I'm not implying any of these champions are all that impressive at the moment. I think most bot laners would much rather deal with a Smolder than a Draven or a Mel bot lane. Likewise, Pyke is a more annoying support than Senna to deal with, but if and when you run into those champions and they get a chance to scale, nothing feels more frustrating than busting your ass to put the enemy Smolder 0-5 only for him to still be priority target number 1 late game by AFK farming for 20 minutes and getting 225. Although, to be fair, that's also the reason why Riot's making so many infinite scalers. Just as it feels demoralizing to put someone behind only for them to scale anyway, it can feel equally demoralizing to play a champion who becomes useless. Smolder's a popular ADC because of that semi-guarantee. If you fall behind on Lucian, Draven, Yunara, Samira, what have you, you're gonna be useless the entire rest of the game. But if you fall behind on Smolder, you still have a shot at turning things around if you're patient enough. You're always a win condition your team can pursue if everything goes to shit. I've had my fair share of games where my Senna, Smolder, Aesol, Kindred, whomever quite literally 1v9'd the game. Although at the same time I've had an equal number of games where we took too long to end and the enemy bel'veth got a few shutdowns and started ripping through our entire team. What do you guys think though? Do you like the new generation of infinite scaling, or do you think Riot's having a bit too much fun with them? Let me know in the comments down below. That'll be all for today, so if you enjoyed the video, I would appreciate it if you'd like to like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other champion discussion videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.